So, we've seen the harms that come from monopoly in the last lecture, and today we're going to start talking about solutions to monopoly. So, we'll start with cases when monopoly is unavoidable or natural. And in lecture 13, we're going to talk about cases when we actually choose to create monopoly. So, when monopoly is avoidable. When monopoly is natural, regulation and subsidies are the standard tools that are used to try to deal with the monopoly problem. So we'll start by talking about when monopoly is natural and when it's unnatural. By the way, I should just make one announcement. So as I mentioned, most of the questions on the midterm are going to be sort of like takeoffs on your problem sets. But that's not true for the past lecture and this lecture, because obviously those aren't covered in your midterms. So, in your problem sets. So, I strongly recommend that you read the exam and solution for the Econ 242 40501 class. I will post that in your old exams, problem sets, etc. section. You should probably also look at last year's midterm and the solution to that. Okay, so we'll start by talking about what it means for monopoly to be natural or unnatural. Then we'll talk about ideal solutions to natural monopoly, why these ideal solutions fail, some second best solutions, in particular average cost pricing, and reasons why average cost pricing can result even when there is no regulation. We'll then talk about the static distortions from average cost pricing, as well as the dynamic distortions, and then the relationship of that to selection, and an application of that to insurance markets. Okay, so today we're going to focus on natural monopoly, but Justin, what things might cause monopolies to arise even when they're not natural?
I guess like there's certain laws like patent laws or intellectual property rights.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Those are good examples, and we'll turn to that not in the next lecture, but lecture 13. Lobbying and protection based on that's not really intellectual property, but is some other particular intervention to protect a given industry. This economists usually think is quite harmful, both from a static and a dynamic perspective, and we can try to stop this by restricting the ability of interest groups to lobby for protection. A third reason is private or illegal violence. So the mafia gains a lot of market power by intimidating its rivals out of the industry in industries that are illegal or sort of semi-legal, like gambling and other sin industries. And those sorts of monopoly should be addressed basically through law enforcement by trying to stop those mafias from operating. Firms can also get an advantage that gives them a temporary monopoly by being the first ones into the market. Time will largely work these out, but it can be helped by transparency or reducing regulations that might stop firms from entering to try to get competition into that industry. But things are trickier when monopoly is what we call inevitable or natural. And stay with me. Does anyone else want to say what it means for a monopoly being natural? Yeah, Matt, fine.
When the least cost solution is achieved by having one firm in the industry?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So one simple condition for that would be that there's economies of scale through the full range of production, right? Because then the bigger the firm is, the more it's going to be able to, the cheaper it's going to be able to produce. And then it never makes sense to have more than one firm, right? And this is the most common case for natural monopoly, but there are also other cases. So in particular, we don't, as Matt articulated, need there to exactly be economies of scale throughout the full range of production. So imagine that the average cost curve for the industry is a normal U-shaped curve like this, but that the demand for the good is like this, right? Well then, if we had two firms, they'd each be producing half as much. So we'd have two firms that were there, and they would have a higher average cost than if we just had one firm, even though this firm is operating in a part of the cost curve where there's actually decreasing returns to scale, right? So we can have what's called subadditivity without having economies of scale over the full range. Now, if the demand got large enough, eventually there would be economies. There would be room for another firm to enter. So if demand got up to here, then half of this would be about here, which would clearly have lower average cost than this. But if you're in the wrong part of the supply curve, then you could end up, if you're in the wrong part of the average cost curve, you could end up having just one firm in that industry. Okay. So what are some examples of natural monopoly, Joe?
Like utility companies
Mhm.
providing like gas, electric power.
Mhm.
So things with large fixed costs, but generally small variable costs.
Yeah, that's right. So electrical utilities, social networks are like this because everyone wants to connect to each other in a social network. If we had a bunch of social networks that didn't interconnect with each other, that would be much less efficient. The government monitors people's income in order to make sure you pay your taxes. And any time that, say, the University of Chicago wants to know what your income is, for a financial aid program or whatever, they ask the government. They don't go out and collect data on your income themselves. Because there's huge economies of scale in collecting people's income. Because if I'm trying to figure out what your income is, it's useful to know what your employer's income is. Because then I can check whatever you report against whatever your employer reports. It doesn't make sense to have a bunch of separate smaller firms doing that. Public transportation in many settings is like this as well. To build a series of L lines, you have to have a lot of people traveling on those to make it worthwhile. It wouldn't make sense to have a bunch of competing L lines because it would much better be spent extending a single network out to a broader range of places, right? Okay. So this is just an example of what I was talking about. If you had a second firm in the industry, right, each would be producing, well, this is, I think, exactly the point at which you move out of natural monopoly, but it was very much related to that picture I was showing there. Okay, so the simplest solution, right, to monopoly would just be to force the firm to charge prices that are equal to marginal cost. That would achieve efficiency. However, when we have economies of scale, right, marginal cost is always going to be below average cost, right? That follows directly from the economies of scale logic. Now, that's not true here, right? Here, the marginal cost would actually be just coming above the average cost. But in many cases, that will occur. And that would require not just the regulator to be involved, but the whole government, right? Why is that? If a firm is operating at a point that's below their average cost, they're going to be making losses. And someone's going to have to provide them subsidies in order to do that. So that doesn't just require a regulator who has the authority to force down their prices. It requires a government to pour all this funding in to make sure that the firm doesn't go bankrupt, right? And this has to come from some sort of a tax on the consumers of the good or on everybody, right? Some sort of income tax or sales tax, right? This would basically require that the industry basically is a public service or a public good because it's getting all these subsidies from the government. So nonetheless, there are some examples where this does happen. So for example, much public transportation actually does make a loss. They're only really required to recoup their variable or marginal costs, not to recoup their fixed costs, and so they're subsidized by the government. The Postal Service makes a loss often. Most governmental services like the DMV and so forth are making losses. Now, unfortunately, this solution, this marginal cost pricing solution, and all the other efficient solutions to the monopoly problem require a lot of information. So if we want marginal cost regulation, it's not enough for us to just know how much costs the firm is incurring at the current prices and quantities that they're doing, which might be possible to do. You might be able to audit them and look through their books and whatever. You need to know the marginal cost. So you need to know how the average cost would change as you change the quantities. And that requires all sorts of experimentation, and it's a very hard thing to try to figure out, right? And a further problem with it is that if we're paying firms based on their marginal cost, if the firm raises their fixed costs somehow, they're going to get paid more, right? And that might be a problem for them if they're being forced to charge their average cost, because that would raise their price and reduce the demand for the good, and that might reduce the amount that they're able to extract, right? But if they're being paid, if everything's based on marginal costs and they can waste however much they want, that could be a real problem if they're getting reimbursed for everything that's not having any effect on the prices that they're charging. Another thing you could do that we talked about last lecture is you could provide Pigouvian subsidies. You could subsidize the firm proportional to the markup, right? But that requires knowing a lot about demand, right? In particular, once we've started to subsidize a little bit, the subsidy we want to give is actually equal to something about the elasticity of demand. And we'd have to measure demand to figure out what that is, right? Another thing you could do, and we'll talk more about this in a couple of lectures, is the firm could try to perfectly price discriminate. You should try to figure out what every consumer is willing to pay for the good. But that requires the firm knowing a whole lot about how much consumers value the good. Though one thing that I think does work quite well in these monopoly situations is that even if you can't perfectly price discriminate, you can often get the firm to price discriminate quite well. So for example, they could charge more to high income people. And this would be more intrusive obviously, but if you were forced to buy your subway tickets through the income tax system, and high income people had to pay more for subway cards, right? You might be able to really fund the subway system that way. And it would be sort of fair because the high income people almost certainly value the subway system more. So that's you can think actually of the income tax system or local income tax system as being a little bit like that. Why does it make sense to have that stuff just be subsidized by the public? Well, that's one way of taxing people for how much they use public transport based on their income, right? Which is what a price discriminating firm would do anyway, right? So we'll talk more about price discrimination later, but that's one way you can think about the role that income tax systems play. So now, of course, the firm might make a lot of money if we do any of these things, if we let them price discriminate or whatever. But we can always have people bid for the right to be the firm in this industry. So any profits that they make, we could potentially extract up front through the competition to be the firm that operates in the market. The problem with that, though, is that you need to not just have one firm that's the most efficient manager of this thing. You need to have multiple people who are competing and all know how much the concession is worth in order to get enough competition to extract the value. And that might be hard to do. A final problem with marginal cost pricing is that it makes it hard to know whether it was worth creating the market in the first place. What do I mean by that? Well, if we charge average cost prices for a good, right, and people are willing to pay those, then we know for sure that it was worth creating that market, right? We know that there's enough